All right, so as you were talking through that, there's people in this room love rules, don't like rules. That's just kind of how it works. But the thing is, whether you like them or not, rules and laws, they're just a part of our culture. They are part of what we do in life. They are here, and we're not going to get rid of them. Whether it be a government or organization or a sport or whatever it is, there will and always will be rules and laws. You know, growing up, I can pick on her because she's helping in the children's ministry right now. My mom is like a stickler for rules. Like, she loves them. She creates new ones. Like, she just loves rules because it gives structure. My mom has run a daycare for 30-some years now. And so when you walk into her house, for her to handle all these kids, there are rules in place. And so she has these kids trained. They follow rules. It's what they do. But as a kid, I tended to be a rule follower. I wanted to make sure I followed the rules and all these different things. But my mom had all these rules, and it started changing for me when I started making friends that didn't have all these rules in place. See, my mom, we had rules that we walked into the house, you take your shoes off, you leave your shoes at the door because she doesn't want the shoes tracking all over the carpet. Mom also had a rule that I had to make my bed every single morning when I woke up to go to school. Every morning. If the bed's not made, I'm in trouble. I'm getting grounded, things like that. She had rules where I couldn't get up from the table until my food was finished, and all these different things. Rules were in place, and so I tended, for the most part, to follow rules. And then I started making friends, and they would see all these rules and go, why do you have to follow all these rules? That's ridiculous. My mom doesn't make me do that. And I started thinking that I've been living this oppressed life, learning that my mom had all these rules in place that I had to follow. One of them was every single night, Monday through Thursday, we had family dinner. And so I could be in the middle of playing outside or playing basketball, whatever it was. I had to leave whatever I was doing to go have dinner. I can go back out afterwards, but I had to break that time with my friends to make sure I had dinner with my family at home. And I learned that very few other families did that. And so when I went, I was like this goody two-shoe kid that had to follow the rules and listen to his mom, and that's what happened. And I always just thought there are so many rules in place in my house. Now, I tend to follow the rules to make sure I didn't get in trouble. But what I missed was, and I'm learning is now as I'm getting older, and now that I have my own kids, I started to understand why my mom wanted shoes not tracked through the house. Especially yesterday at t-ball practice when my oldest son decided to overshoot first base and fall in the mud puddle because he was running so fast, he told me. Because then he's a mess, so I'm like, I don't want him tracking in our house with all that stuff. I started understanding why that she wanted us to clean up after ourselves and do all these things because it made the house look better. It made our lives look better. We were living a better life that way, whatever those rules were. Now, don't get me wrong. There were some ridiculous rules that my mom had that were just absolutely stupid, and you don't tell her that because she'll kill me. But that's just how it worked. And so there's rules, there's regulations, there's laws, and I tell you this because I want to remind all of us there's rules in place for a reason. What I've learned in my life is I've learned that the rules were there for a reason, but my problem was, as a kid and even sometimes an adult, I tend to look at rules and miss the purpose of the rule. Growing up as a kid, I focused on the rule to make sure I wasn't in trouble, and I missed the person behind the rules. I missed the fact that my mom was putting these rules in place to raise her kids in a certain way, to call us to live a life in a certain way. And that's a lot of the reasons why rules and laws are in place. No matter how you feel about rules, whether you like them or not, whether they're family rules or work rules or civil rules, traffic rules, government rules, they're there, right or wrong, and they're put in place with the intention of helping and protecting the people in that specific community, whether it's a home or a community or a state, whatever that may be. And oftentimes that can lead to feel like it's a burden or frustration. Rules can feel like, from some of us who don't like rules, it feels like this heavy weight that's on us that we don't like dealing with. We don't like dealing with it at work. We don't like dealing with it at home or in our government, whatever that may be. We just don't like it, and they can be confusing. The rules cannot make sense sometimes. Jesse James, catch rules, Steelers, Patriots. Anybody with me? It doesn't make sense. Other times, we love rules because it gives us this order in life. It makes us feel good about ourselves. We feel that the rules and laws are good for us because it gives us this structure that we can live our lives according to. And when we do that, we feel good about ourselves. But the rules are there, and no matter how we view them, whether we like it or not, I think we have a tendency to sometimes miss the reason behind the rule. I think that's especially true when it comes to this whole thing called Christianity and faith and religion. You see, a lot of times I think us and people look at faith and religion and Christianity as just this set of rules that we have to follow. This list of things, these do this, don't do that. Make sure you're following all these rules. And if you do these things a certain way at a certain time, in a certain place, then God's going to be happy with you. And if God's happy with you, your life's going to be better because of it. So we view this thing as just a bunch of rules and lists and laws. And so for some of us, we see that, and some of us in this room like that. Some of us like to follow the structure and say, if I just do these things, my life's going to go better, and I'll follow these rules, I'll follow this list, and everything will go better because of it. And there's some of us here who kind of despise that, thinking that God's just this God with a bunch of rules that we have to follow, and if we follow him right, then he'll be happy with us. But if we don't follow him right, he's going to be frustrated with us, mad at us. And so we respond to that by saying, you know what, forget that. I don't need that. I don't want to deal with a God that's going to base his judgment on me and my ability to jump through his hoops. Or we think, you know what, I'm not going to worry about the laws because God's cool with me no matter what, no matter if I follow the rules or not. So if he's not cool with me about that, then don't worry about it. Forget him. And so we kind of like the rules or we don't like the rules, but we look at sometimes as this faith in Jesus and this trust in God as just a list of rules. And that can get in the way of a real relationship with God. You see, there are lists of rules and laws that God's kind of put in place for us to live by. But what if God's laws are meant to give us freedom and not be a burden? What if the reason he does this, the reason there's these rules in place are not to be a burden for us, to actually be a point of freedom for us, of a life he's calling us to live? See, this is the tension we're walking through today in this Upside Down series. As we're walking through Jesus' most famous teaching, he walks through this idea of laws and rules. And this tension that we're dealing with today, it's going to be a tension that the people dealt with in the crowd that he was teaching to in this setting that we read in the book of Matthew in the Bible. You see, they dealt with the law, the Jewish law, where there was all these lists of rules and regulations they had to follow. And after listing, Jesus said these values of how his followers should live and talking about how they're going to be this big influential force on this world, he then jumps into rules. And not just saying, hey, here's the hundreds of rules you have to follow. He talks about what these rules and their purposes are. He starts off by saying, after he talks about salt and light, he says this in Matthew 5:17 through 20. He says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. When Jesus came onto this scene teaching, and he's doing these miracles, and his ministry is just growing in popularity, and people are really intrigued by this Jesus guy. People were excited about him because they thought that he was introducing some new teachings, and they actually said they called his teachings new teachings, thinking that Jesus was actually moving away from the Jewish law that they lived by for generations and thousands of years. And they're trusting that, they're excited about that, and they had all these hundreds of laws and rules that the Jews had to follow. And they were some pretty crazy rules that they had to make sure that they made sure they were following civil rules and moral rules and like spiritual rules. They had to act and live a certain way to even go and offer a sacrifice at the temple. And if they didn't do that correctly, they were viewed unclean, and their worship and their sacrifice wouldn't work. So they had to follow all these rules and regulations. And so they're thinking that maybe Jesus is ushering something new, something better. And Jesus tells them he's not teaching anything new. He's not here to get rid of the rules and laws. He's not dismissing them. He's so serious about this, he even warns the crowd by saying, hey, if you start getting rid of these rules that God's put in place, you're going to miss your part in God's kingdom. You're going to be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. And that's a big deal in that culture, similar as is in here, because back then, it was all about status. So Jesus is saying, you know what, if you start just dismissing what God calls you to do, and you teach others to dismiss it as well, you're going to be called the least in his kingdom. No one wants that in that culture. So they're kind of paying attention to this. And then what he says, he tells the crowd, after he says that, he's not ignoring the rules, he's not getting rid of them. What he's actually doing here is he's actually taking them deeper into the God's rules. He's not showing them what the rule is. He's showing them the purpose and the person behind the rules and what the purpose of that is. He then tells the crowd that their righteousness, their right way of living, their way of living in accordance to God's law has to become better than the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, or they can't enter into God's kingdom. Now, there was a few times in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that he would have dropped jaws. People would have looked at him like he was crazy, wondering why he's teaching this. And this was definitely one of those moments, because here's the deal. In that culture, like I've mentioned, they had to follow all of these rules and regulations and laws. This just Jewish religion was filled with hundreds and hundreds of laws. If you take a Bible and you go to the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament, which is early on in the Bible, it just starts listing law after law after law, and it's crazy. It sounds ridiculous. And you read it and you realize there's no way I could ever follow this. And so the Jewish people are trying to do whatever they can to live up to these rules and regulations, because that's what God's called them to do. And if they follow the rules, God's going to be happy with them. And in that culture, to make sure that they were following the rules correctly, they would go and seek guidance from the religious leaders in that day. And the main religious leaders in that day were called Pharisees. Now, Pharisees were such a big deal in that culture. They had status, they had wealth, they had respect, but they were masters of the Jewish law. In fact, they had Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first kind of 5 books in the Bible, memorized word for word by the age of 13 years old. And then what would happen is if they were deemed good enough in that culture, they would be selected by an older religious leader to be their apprentice. And they would be taught the ways of the religious leaders, and they would grow up in this status, they grow up in this culture, and they had it all. They were wealthy. They had it under control. People would seek them for wisdom and guidance. They had everything memorized. And Jesus is telling them now that if you want to be a part of God's kingdom, if you want to follow me, if you want to live upside down, the way you live, the righteousness that you have in your life has to be better than the Pharisees and the other teachers of the law. And they're thinking, there is no way this is possible. There's no way. How could they do that? How can this be? But here's the deal. Jesus knew what the Pharisees were all about. In fact, if you see, when you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you read the story of Jesus' life. And he had points of contention. He was getting frustrated with people. He got frustrated with the religious leaders because here's what they knew about them. He knew they were so focused on the rule that the Pharisees tended to miss the reason behind the rule. They were all about following the laws perfectly, that they missed the fact that the reason for the laws being created to begin with was to help them know and follow God and to love people. Instead, it became a checklist that made them look good rather than being a transformation of their heart to let God change them from the inside out. For instance, there was a law about keeping the Sabbath. And so from Friday evening into Saturday, this was the Jewish Sabbath. And what that meant was they couldn't work. They couldn't do anything that would exert a lot of energy. It was a time for them to relax, rest, and worship God. But what the Pharisees did, they started getting really nitpicky about what it meant to be a proper following Jew of the Jewish law. And so what they would say is, you know what? You can't work during the Sabbath, so that means you can't even look in the mirror. Huh? Because what would happen, the Pharisees says, if you looked in the mirror and then maybe you saw a gray hair, you'd be tempted to pluck that gray hair out. And if you pluck that gray hair out, that is work on the Sabbath. And you're breaking the Sabbath, you're breaking the laws, and you broke the rules, and now God's mad at you. Now, if I did that, you can see, my friends are being really generous to remind me of this. I'd be working all day because I'm getting more and more gray hair every single day. But God, what the Pharisees did in this culture is they took the rule and made it all about this checklist to follow to make sure by saying, you got to do all these little things, and if you do it wrong, you're in trouble. And this is where the Pharisees really had everything under control here, because they were like, yeah, I can follow that. I won't look in the mirror. I am holy. I am pious. I've got this whole thing under control. But then on the flip side, they added rules to what God's law was. They would also take away definition too. For instance, God's law said to love your neighbor as yourself. But then the Pharisees started wondering, you know what, who's my neighbor? And what they started doing is saying, if someone doesn't look and act and think like them, they're not really your neighbor, so you don't have to serve them. So it was really easy for a Pharisee to put this law in place by saying, you know what? If someone is sick, if they have diseases, if they are unclean, we as God's holy people can't serve them because then we would become unclean, so they're not really your neighbor. They would give reasons for why they shouldn't love their neighbor. Plucking a gray hair out is against God's law, according to the Pharisees, but helping a sick and broken person is not something you should do. So you see here, this is how the law started getting twisted. And what Jesus was showing the people here is by saying they were so focused on the rules that they missed the person behind the rules. They missed the fact that the reason God put these in place was to help them know, follow, trust, and love God, and to love people, because that's what God was all about. So they had these rules in place. They were focusing on this stuff, and Jesus said, no, you're missing it. It's not about how you look on the outside. It's about what's happening on the inside. The actions that you live, the way you live your life, it's an overflow of your heart. Not about following the list and the rules. Jesus wasn't getting rid of the rules. He was saying, what's the purpose of you trying to follow the rules? Because for Jesus, his way of living, if someone was hurt, someone was broken, you love them, you help them, you do whatever you can to serve them. It wasn't about trying to be this holy, perfect person. It was about being this person that loved and followed God. And then what Jesus did here is right after that, he says, he's like, you have to surpass the religious leaders to follow me. He's saying it's about your heart more than your ability to follow rules. And then what he does, he starts listing rules. And what he would do is, and we're going to go through this quickly, but he would list a law that everyone in that crowd would have recognized and believed to be true. But then he would take it a little deeper with them and show them the heart of the matter. And then show them there's ways to live this out. And so what we're going to do here, I don't have time to dig into these because it's a nice day. We want to go enjoy Pittsburgh today, enjoy our families and our community. That's fine. But what I want to do is this. I'm going to go through these kind of somewhat quickly. But here's what we're going to do. Because there's so many good things that Jesus says about the law here, that if you are on our Facebook page, if you're on our Facebook page, look up One Church Pittsburgh, like it. Each day this week, we are going to dig in deeper with that. So we're going to post a couple-minute video talking through what Jesus was saying more in these situations, because we don't have time to dig through them all today. But we're going to go through them kind of by topic to show what Jesus was trying to get across from here. And like I said, follow us on Facebook this week. We're going to do a lot more to dig into more of what Jesus meant when he says that. But he says the first thing in Matthew 5:21, he says, you have heard it said, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment, which is good. Jesus says don't kill somebody else. Like, I'm sure by anyone here, we all can agree with that. Shouldn't murder, seems reasonable. Don't kill anyone, got it. If someone does, they'll be subject to judgment. Seems fair, laws, justice. We're probably pretty much tracking what Jesus is saying right here. But then he says, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Now, in the last week, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands because I know the answer for all of us. Have you guys gotten mad at anybody? A child or a coworker or a neighbor or someone driving on the parkway with you, like you've gotten angry, right? And Jesus is saying here that, yeah, you've heard the law says don't murder. Cool, everyone agrees with that. He says, I tell you that if you have anger with anybody else, you're subject to the same judgment. Now it sounds kind of crazy. And this is what Jesus says. He would say each time, you've heard it said, but I tell you, and he takes them deeper into this. And what Jesus is saying, it's not just about the action of murdering someone, but also the emotion behind the action. Our anger leads us to hate. It leads us to hurt people and view them as less than us. And Jesus was equating that to murder. Now, there is nothing against the law in our country that says that you are not allowed to hate people. In fact, you can see that happening pretty regularly in our culture today. Whatever reason that may be, people are hating on everybody. But Jesus calls his followers to something more, something better, something upside down. It's not just about the action, it's about the emotion that you have to have under control. It's about the way you view people and the way you serve people and the way you interact with them. And Jesus goes on to explain that if anyone is on their way to the temple to give a sacrifice, which was the religious practice of that day, but they have a beef with somebody else, they should leave that sacrifice, don't sacrifice it, and go back to the person and fix the situation that's happening. Jesus is saying here, it's people over practice, it's relationships over religion. And this is something that Jesus brought his people into deeper, that it's not about following the rules, it's about how you love God and love people. That we should respond to people, even if they do something that offends us or hurts us or whatever that may be. How do we respond to them without anger? It's something more than that. He's not calling us just to follow the rule. He's calling us into love. Then he says this. He says, you have heard it said that you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out, throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to go into hell. Again, he says, you've heard it said. And Jesus says this and mentions not to cheat on your spouse, not to commit adultery. Again, we're for that. That's something we believe in our culture here today too. But then he says, I tell you, and says that even looking at someone with lust is adultery. Now, this is a heavy thing in our sexually driven culture. Now, looking at someone and thinking that someone's attractive isn't a sin, but looking at someone with continued action and thoughts is. What he's saying is when you're looking at someone with lust and you're longing for something that's not yours, that's not part of your relationship and your marriage and things like that, that is what's broken. That is what's sinful. Again, this is about the care and love for people. Yeah, don't cheat on your spouse or significant other. We're for that. But don't even entertain the thought of it, Jesus is saying. Our thoughts can fester and turn into problems that cause pain and brokenness. Our culture is addicted to sex. It's addicted to pornography. All these different things that are just infiltrating our lives and our families. It's part of the brokenness. And this goes back to what Jesus is saying here. It's not just about the physical act of committing adultery. It's about the heart in the matter of it. Are you lusting after something else? Jesus even goes to say, this is some metaphorical type language he's using. He's saying, it's better to gouge out your eye or cut off your hand than stumble. And what he's saying here is, do whatever you can to put the guardrails in your life to make sure you don't even go down that path. If you're struggling with looking, get rid of the thing you're looking at. If it's a struggle with your computer, get rid of your computer or put the precautions on your computer to make sure that's not even a temptation anymore. Whatever that may be, he's saying make sure there's those boundaries in place. Now, he's exaggerating here, just to be clear. He's not telling us to gouge our eye out or cut our hand off. Jesus wasn't about self-mutilation. It's pretty intense. What he's saying here is make sure we're doing what we can to keep our hearts pure. Not about the laws, not about the rules, it's about our hearts. Then he says this, it's been said that anyone who divorces his wife must be given her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her a victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now listen, I know this is a sensitive topic in our culture with divorce. Divorce is a big deal. About 50% of marriages end in divorce, and that number is the same for Christians and non-Christians alike. It's not like Christians have this this handle of the market of marriage and we've got it all figured out. About 50% of Christian marriages end in divorce too. And the reason for that is that what Jesus is getting at here is that divorce often happens because we just give up. He says the only permission for divorce is adultery. Because in that culture, they were creating laws and rules and regulations of why someone can get divorced. In the Jewish culture, a husband could divorce his wife if she burnt his dinner. And the Pharisees would give all these extra rules and regulations of why they could divorce their wives. And in today's culture, we look for reasons of why we should get divorced too. And what we tend to do is this, is we tend to look at our own needs as greater than the needs of our spouse. And that creates problem in our marriage. When we look at our marriage as what feeds me, what completes my needs, what takes care of me, when those expectations aren't met, it causes problems, it causes fighting, it causes distrust, and eventually leads to a broken relationship and possibly even divorce. So we end up looking at our own needs rather than the needs of our spouse, and that leads to us making whatever reason we can to think this relationship is not working. And let me be clear here. I know that divorce happens. And I know there are you in this room who have gone through that for a variety of reasons. Whatever that may be. And for whatever that reason was, I want to be very clear to that. That does not separate you from God. That does not make you separated from church. And maybe you felt like that before and you've gone to a church and because of the brokenness that's been in your life before and you feel like, I can't be here, God's not happy with me. That's not true. That's why Jesus came, to show people that's not true. There is grace, there is love for you no matter what. And I want you to make sure you know that this morning. But in regard to marriage, what God is saying, what Jesus is teaching here, that we have to work and fight for our marriages. But by no means do we ever stay in a situation that's unsafe for us or for children, but we work to fight for our relationships. So Jesus takes us deeper into what marriage and divorce is all about. Then he says this, again, you have heard it said a long time ago that do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows that you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to do is simply say yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. And what happened in that culture is people would make these crazy vows. They would say, I swear by this, this, and this, I'm going to do this. But when they didn't want to do that, they would make up some reason of why they could get out of their vow. And what Jesus is saying here is be truthful. Let your yes be yes. Let your no be no. And be people of honesty. Be people of truth. You guys ever go to a car mechanic and you go and they start talking and you have no idea what they're talking about? And you don't know if they're truthful, you don't know if they're lying, you don't know if they're trying to dupe you into spending more money in your car that you don't have to spend money on. But then you get to a car mechanic that they're just honest. They're like, hey, listen, this is going to need done, but not now. Or, hey, this really needs to get done or your car's going to break down probably in the next couple weeks. Whatever, they're just honest with you by saying, hey, here's what you have to get done now, here's what you don't have to get done, here's what you have to take care of in the future. When I've meet car mechanics like that, I love it because I don't know what I'm doing with cars. But when there's honesty involved in relationships, we can trust them. They can let us know when their yeses are yes, their no's are no's. It changes the way we interact with them. And Jesus is calling his followers to live the same way. And he says this, you've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to one who asks you, and do not turn away from those who want to borrow from you. Jesus says it's not about seeking revenge. He says, blessed are the peacemakers before this. He says, but by looking out, our goal is to look out for those in need. You see, in that culture, Roman soldiers could require a Jewish person to carry their gear and their equipment for up to 1 mile. They were traveling along the road, they could say, hey, you need to carry my gear for this mile. And then by law, they just stop after 1 mile and give it back to them. And Jesus is saying, hey, listen, I know this is annoying, and the Jews hated this, by the way. He says, hey, I know this is annoying to you. I know you don't like it. But I tell you, as a person who follows me, go 2 miles. Go the extra mile. This is where that statement comes from. He's saying we look out to serve those people, even if they don't deserve it. And those in need, we look to serve them as well. If they are in need, we give to them. We help them. We love them. It's not about, making everything fair and making everything even. There's nothing that's fair in this world. It doesn't work that way. And Jesus acknowledges that. He said, don't look for being fair. Look to love. And look to serve. He says, you have heard it said that love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Again, Jesus said, it's easy to love people. It's easy to love people like you, loving your friends, loving your family. And it's not easy to love your neighbor or your enemies. And in that culture, it's very common to hate the enemy, hate the Roman Empire, hate the people who weren't like you, hate the people who didn't believe like you or think like you. And Jesus says, no, you love your enemies and you pray for those who aren't like you and even go against you. This is what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And then he ends it by saying this in verse 48, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. He closes out this section of his teaching by saying, be perfect. I want to be clear here. What he's saying here, and this is where we miss it in our translation to the English. He's not saying that we have to follow the rules perfectly. What he's saying is be mature, be holy, which means to be set apart in the way you live, like God is holy and set apart by the way he calls us to live. The perfection he's calling us to do is saying, no, it's about being different. It's about living upside down. It's about your heart rather than your ability to follow the rules. Because your heart, if it's for God, it's going to help you, lead you to live in a way that loves God and loves people like Jesus is calling us to do in this section. Okay, I know this was a lot, but here's what I want to do to kind of help us wrap this up. Jesus gives these teachings for a reason. And that reason was true for them in that culture. It's the same reason it's true for us today. It's about our heart. It's about our willingness and our desire to follow Jesus and not necessarily focus everything on following the rules. Because we're not going to be able to follow the rules properly. We're going to break the rules. We're going to struggle with it. You see, the Pharisees, they were all about looking good with all their pious rule following, but instead they were greedy, they were deceitful, and they were selfish. They were all about themselves. And Jesus wasn't looking for that from his followers. He wasn't looking for that from them then, and he's not looking for that from us now. He's looking at our hearts before our actions, because it's our hearts that will lead to real, love-filled obedience. The way we live and follow Jesus is impacted more by our love and our devotion to him than our own righteous acts. See, wherever you're at today, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, I want you to understand this. Your status with God is not predicated on your ability to follow a bunch of rules. It's not about your ability to go to church each week. It's not about your ability to put on a good front. It's not about your ability to act righteous. It's not about knowing and following, all these rules. It's about knowing, following, and loving Jesus because of how much he loves you. And that love will lead to obedience. It's not obedience that leads to love. We often make this so complicated in our culture. We make it so complicated in our churches. Because we act like we have to try to look right, act right, think right, but somehow we miss how simple it is, and it's this. And the one thing I want to walk away from is this. A life following Jesus leads us to obedience. Obedience doesn't lead us to Jesus. We often think of God and Christianity as a bunch of rules to follow. But it's not about following a bunch of rules. It's about following a man that knew the rules, lived the rules, and perfected the rules. It's our following of Jesus that leads us to obedience. It's not our obedience that leads us to Jesus. And hopefully when you hear that, it's a breath of fresh air for you. Because maybe your whole life you've thought this God guy was just this guy you had to follow and live up to all these rules so he'd be happy with you. But what Jesus showed was God was so in love with you, he sent Jesus before you could ever perfect the rules, because we're never going to do it to begin with. He sent him because he loves you. And that should call us to love him back. And that's what's going to lead us to follow Jesus in the way he calls us to. But something that's important here, and something that helps, is knowing this. We can't do this by ourselves. We were never meant to follow Jesus alone. He wasn't talking to a single person in this teaching. He was talking to a crowd, knowing that they needed to help each other to do this together, to encourage and spur one another on to love and follow him as they love other people. And so we know that to be true here with One Church. And so to help with that, I want to offer you an opportunity that's going to help you explore, know, and follow Jesus more. And that's going to lead to a life that God's calling you to live. And that's something we call small groups here at One Church. What a small group is, it's when a group of people get together outside of Sunday mornings to gather as One Church. They meet in people's homes and they do a few different things. One, it's food focused. Now, I should be able to pull some of your attention just by saying that. It's food focused. We all love food, and food brings people together. And at small groups, people bring food to share together. There's a chance to hang out, get to know each other, and build those relationships, because that leads to the next focus in our small groups, and that's relationship focused. It's really easy to come in here every week. You can say hi to a few people, and that's great, but then you can leave here without really connecting with other people. And that's not going to help us be a church that we're striving to be. That's not going to help you in your own following and exploring of knowing who God is. And so small groups help us build relationships with people in the church. And so we want to help you do that. It's also scripture focused. In small groups, the group gets together and they go through some of the Bible together, read it, they discuss it together, they explore it together. They don't have to have it all figured out together. They're just trying to know and understand who God is to help each other follow God in the way he calls us to live. It's also prayer focused. Small groups pray for each other and with each other. I've never met anyone in my life who didn't want to be prayed for. Small groups take time to talk about life and pray for what's going on in them. And then finally, small groups are mission focused. Small groups help encourage one another to follow Jesus in our everyday lives. We can't follow Jesus alone. We need each other to help with that, and small groups do that. And so we're launching small groups here with One Church to fulfill our mission to work as one to help people follow Jesus. And I want to invite you to join in with one of those small groups. We have 2 groups starting in May. One group's going to happen on Sunday nights. Another group's going to happen on Tuesday evenings. And if we have enough interest, we're going to launch another one on Wednesday evenings. But I want to encourage you and invite you to try out a small group. These groups are going to last for 6 weeks. So you're not committing months and months and months of your time going, what am I getting myself into? It's 6 weeks. Try it out. See what happens. See what happens in your lives. See what happens in your family's lives. See what happens in your own relationship with God, because I promise you, it's going to build it, it's going to encourage it, it's going to strengthen those relationships in your lives with God and other people. If you have kids, bring them. They're kid-friendly places. If you have little kids, people will take turns watching those kids in the group to make sure the group can continue to meet the way they need to. Groups are for any and all people, and I promise you, this is going to help you know and follow Jesus better. So here's what I encourage you to do. If you're interested in what a small group looks like, you want to try it out, fill out your Connect card today and mark down you're interested in small group. If a Sunday night works better, or a Tuesday night works better, or another night of the week works better, mark that on there so we know, and we'll follow up with you, help you get connected with those groups. And I'm telling you, this is going to help us have a life of following Jesus. It's going to lead to obedience. Instead of us individually trying to be obedient so we get to Jesus, that's never going to work. Too often we equate Christianity and God with following a bunch of rules and laws, but that's not what God was looking for. It's not what he is looking for. He wants people who love and are devoted to him because he knows that's going to lead us to a life of freedom and not a life of brokenness and frustration. The world doesn't need a bunch of rule followers either, because that doesn't flip anything upside down. The world needs fully devoted followers of Jesus who love God and love people to the point that they go out of their way to serve other people, to love other people, that we treat people with dignity and love, and we worship God by our actions. That's what the world needs. That's what the world's going to notice, and that's how Jesus calls us to live. The world has enough Pharisees. Let's give them more followers of Jesus. That's upside down, and that's something we do together. So I'm going to pray. But I want to remind us the reason this happened is because of God sending Jesus. If you ever feel like I can never make it, I'm not good enough, I struggle, I've got brokenness, I've got baggage, I'm never going to be good enough for God. God shows you that that's wrong thinking because he sent Jesus. Jesus came to love us, to serve us, to show us what life with God looks like. And he said it wasn't about your ability to follow the rules. It was about your heart to follow him. And in that, that's going to transform us to be obedient to have the life that God's calling us to live. Jesus loved us so much that he didn't just come to teach, he came to serve. And his greatest act of service to us was laying down his life for us, to rescue us, to give us a new life. And each week at One Church, we celebrate and worship God in that through communion. And I'm going to ask the veterans who've been here, you know what's happening. We pass out communion. They're these prepackaged communion cups. And on the top layer, there's the bread. Under the second layer, there's the juice. And we take it together here after this next song. But what this is a chance for us to remember is that God loved us so much that he sent his son to die for us. And it's in that we were reminded that we are never, ever going to be able to follow the rules to live up to God's expectations. But we have a God who met us where we're at and gave us his son. And said, hey, follow him, because he's going to lead you to how life is supposed to be. It's not about the rules. It's about our heart. And God showed his heart in us through his son Jesus, through his crucifixion. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for today. Thank you for this morning we can gather as one church. Thank you for the beautiful weather outside. God, thank you for loving us, knowing that we can't keep up with the rules, that we're going to struggle with that. But your view of us, your status with us hasn't predicated on our ability to follow the rules. Our status with you is defined by Jesus. Jesus came to show us to live out the life that you've called us to live. And he gave his life up for us so that we can have a life with you. God, help us to love you because of how much you love us, because that's going to lead us to follow you, to trust you, to be obedient to you. We can't do the rules, so help us to love. Let that change us from the inside out. That's your name we pray.